Lesson 5.8, Factor Linear Expressions. A monomial is a number, a variable, or a product of a number and one or more variables. To factor a number means to write it as a product of its factor. A monomial can be factored using the same method you would use to factor a number. The greatest common factor, or the GCF, of two monomials is the greatest monomial that is a factor of both. So if we go down to example A here, we have 12 and 28c, and our directions ask us to find the greatest common factor for each pair of monomials. When we're finding the greatest common factor, we want to know what's the biggest number that goes into both of those. So what we're going to do is we're going to make factor trees. So I'm going to start with 12. Okay, and I'm going to factor my 12 down. And you keep factoring until you have all prime numbers left. Okay, now that my 12 is factored with all prime numbers, I'm going to move to 28. I know that 7 and 4 go into 28. I can factor my 4 down. And again, I have all prime numbers. So after you have your factor trees made, then you look to see what factors do we have in common. What prime numbers are in common? I have a 2 and I have a 2. So then you multiply those two numbers together, and that's your greatest common factor. After you found the greatest common factor with your numbers, then you look to see, do you have any variables in common? Well, in this case, I have a C here. I have nothing. So my greatest common factor would be 4. If we look at letter C, I have 42mn and I have 14mn. First, I'm going to factor my numbers. So I'm going to start with 42. I know that 6 and 7 go into 42. I can factor my 6 down into 3 and 2. Now I have all prime numbers, so I move to 14. 14 can be factored by 2 and 7, and those are both prime numbers. So again, I look to see, what numbers do I have in common? What factors are common? I have a 2 in both tree, and I have a 7 in both tree. So I'm going to multiply those together. So I know my greatest common factor is 14. And then I look at my variables. Do I have any variables in common? I have an m in both, and I have an n in both. So my greatest common factor would be 14mn. Okay? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to factor linear expressions. So you can use a distributive property and work backwards strategy to express a linear expression as a product of its factors. A linear expression is in factored form when it is expressed as a product of its factors. So just like addition and subtraction are opposite of each other, multiplication and division are opposite of each other, the distributive property and factoring are opposite of each other. So if we go down to the got it, our directions say factor each expression. If the expression cannot be factored, right cannot be factored. And you can use algebra tiles if you need it. So if we look at letter D, we have 4x minus 28. We have to ask ourselves, what goes into 4 that also goes into 28? Well, I know that 2 goes into both of them, so I'm going to factor a 2 out. To factor a 2 out means I'm going to put a 2 out front, and I'm going to divide each term by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, and I bring down my x, minus 28 divided by 2, which would be 14. Okay? Now that I have factored it once, I have to go and look inside my parentheses. Can I factor it any farther? Is there anything that goes into 2 that also goes into 14? Well, I can take a 2 out of both of those. So I'm going to factor out another 2. So I have the first 2 here, and then we multiply that times this next 2 we're factoring out. So then I divide each term by 2 again. So 2x divided by 2 would be x, minus 14 divided by 2 is 7. Okay? Now that I have factored that, again I ask myself, is there anything in common between 1x and 7? There's no common factors, so now I just need to simplify this. So I got to take 2 times 2, which is 4, so my factored form would be 4 times the quantity x minus 7. Okay, a way to double check, you can distribute that 4 back in, and you should get the same expression you started with. If we look at letter E, I have 3x plus 33y. I ask myself, what is common between 3 and 33? I know I can take a 3 out of both of those. So I divide each term by 3, so 3x divided by 3 is x, plus 33y divided by 3, which is 11y. Again, I ask myself, can I factor anything else? And not necessarily just numbers. Is there any variables I can factor out? Do I have any common variables? In this case, I have nothing. I have a 1 and an 11. There's no common factor besides 1. I have an x and a y. They're not the same variable. So my factored form of 3x plus 33y is 3 times the quantity x plus 11y. If we look at letter F, I have 4x plus 35. Again, I ask myself, is there anything common between 4 and 35? There's no common factors, so as our directions stated, we need to write cannot be factored.